of course, that is probably going into 2024, possibly the weakest position, at least on paper, for this Miami team. Obviously, Timothy Merritt's not going to help this this coming fall. But in regards to any particular position, even though the list of targets is star-studded, extremely impressive, all over the place, is there a position that might be a little thin? Maybe not necessarily in terms of targets, but where you think the leans are headed and maybe in the wrong direction?
You know, to begin with, Mark, you brought up the secondaries, right? And I think the secondary is a key position group to look at. Not only because of, like you mentioned, we just haven't had the quality guys in the past, and currently just the depth is just not there. We don't have the amount of bodies that you would see at a top SEC program or some of the other teams that are competing for a national championship. We just don't have the quality bodies yet. A lot of the guys that we're bringing in are true freshmen, still need to be within the program for a year or two to really get there. But the secondary this year is going to be very similar to how Mario treated the offensive line class his first year, and of course the defensive line this past year. When you look at the secondary class very closely, we have a lot of local targets that Miami's going after. Just from the top, I mean, DJ Pickett is the obvious one, right? He's probably the number one prospect on a lot of college boards, including Miami. He's going to be visiting Miami this upcoming weekend. He's also visiting Oregon at his last official visit weekend, which is going to be the other school to watch besides Miami. But I really like where Miami sits with DJ Pickett. This is a guy that is a legacy, Miami legacy. We already have family members currently on the team in Booker Pickett. And this is a young man that Miami has done their due diligence from beginning to end and has always shown love and been consistent throughout the recruiting process. And this is something that has not been done in the past, especially in past staffs before Mario Cristobal. But besides DJ Pickett, there are other names, especially in the wide receiver room, that are five-star guys that Miami just has continued to recruit, even though they may not seem like the top contender. There's a lot of stuff behind the scenes that's required in recruiting to really make sure that you're in it in the long haul. And Miami really shot themselves in the foot before Mario got here. And it really seems like the more and longer Mario is here and the staff gets comfortable, you're starting to see that the relationships between a lot of these guys can really hit a switch once we start winning football games. But DJ Pickett is at the top of the list in the secondary. We talked about Timothy Merritt, who we just added on. But then you got Ben Hanks as well, another guy from Booker T. Washington who just visited Florida this past weekend. His father obviously played at Florida. He's a Florida legacy. This was a guy for, 4, 5, 6 months. Anybody who's followed recruiting like myself, everyone kind of, was wondering, why is Florida not the top school? Why is Florida not the top school? It's always been Miami, Miami, Miami. Well, after this past weekend, of course, Florida makes the pitch of, hey, you're a Florida legacy, kind of similar to Vernell Brown, kicking the tires on that and hoping some things gain some traction. But Ben Hanks is another guy from our backyard in Booker T. Washington that is one of probably the most skilled guys in the secondary in South Florida. I would probably put him up there, right there with anybody in the nation. He's a guy that Miami's targeted at the top of the board from beginning to end. So look out for Ben Hanks as well. You also got Aiden Anding, who just visited Miami this past weekend along with his younger brother, who we offered as well. So that's a good relationship that Miami is building. Look out for Aiden Anding. And Jabari Antoine, who is obviously an LSU commit, visited Miami this past weekend. That's another guy that Miami has continued to do their due diligence, even though he is committed to another top program. They're going to chop wood until he signs. Very similar to what happened last year with a young man out of IMG in the secondary in Robinson. So look for the Jabari Antoine saga recruitment to be very similar to that, and I think we have a very good shot. And Chris Ewald, again, we talk about guys in our backyard. This is a guy from Chaminade, Madonna. It's going to be between Georgia and Miami. He already has a commitment date in line, and he's another young man that will be visiting Miami this upcoming weekend. So Chris Ewald is probably at the top of the list out of every position group as far as next possible commitments I would see is Chris Ewald. You also got Naeem Alford, Bryce Fitzgerald, Amari Wallace. You got Drake Stubbs, who's currently committed to USC, but again, another guy that Miami, Florida, and Florida State have been doing their due diligence, making sure they recruit from beginning to end. And that's a young man that I expect to decommit from USC and probably stay local in the state of Florida. So that'll be a battle between the three in-state schools. And then the two other guys I mentioned, in Andrew Purcell and Eric Winters, who are teammates from the state of Alabama, who visited this past weekend. We're sitting pretty good with both of those guys. But again, Georgia, we're gonna hear Georgia a lot, not only with those guys, Elijah Griffin, who visited this past weekend as well. We're just going head to head with Georgia and some of these big dogs. And it just goes to show you that Mario and the staff is really evaluating on the right guys. But your question at the end, after the secondary, who is that one position group where you're kind of, nodding your head or kind of trying to figure out where the numbers lie or who we may land? And honestly, as crazy as this may sound, it's the wide receiver group. Currently when you look at our wide receiver room, we're stacked. I would put our wide receiver room up against any ACC team with ease. And one of the top wide receiver rooms in the country, like you've seen on social media. We're ranked high for a reason. You bring in a guy like Sam Brown, who's had 800 plus yards, already been under Shannon Dawson's offense. You already have Jacoby George and Xavier Strepo in the mix. And then you got some young dogs that are just hungry, ready for their opportunity, like a Ray Joseph, like a Robbie Washington. And then you throw Elijah Arroyo and Elijah Lofton in the mix, and Shamar Kirk, who's a transfer from JUCO. Dude, we're hungry. We got guys that are ready to eat. And this is going to be the year where with Cam Ward, you're going to have to push the football down the football field. And a lot of these guys are going to get the opportunity to where it's going to be a lot easier down the road. Once we start playing football games, a lot of these wide receivers that we're in the mix for, whether it's Jamie French, Vernell Brown, Tyler Williams, Cortez Mills, Joshua Moore, those guys, a lot of those guys, especially the French and the Browns of the world, you got to wait till football games are played to where they could really see with their own eyes that we're going to be productive on the football field. Very similar to how some of the defensive line targets that we targeted in last cycle. We didn't really start to gain that momentum for guys like, Justin Scott and Marquise Lightfoot until games started being played. And they were able to see a guy like Ruben Bain be at the top of the top, not only on the football field on our team, but in the country as a true freshman. So it allowed these young guys that we were recruiting at that position group to see the opportunity for themselves. They have, as long as they believe that they have what it takes, we're going to put them in the opportunity to succeed. So we're going to have to do the same thing this year in the wide receiver room. And that's why you bring in a guy like Cam Ward. That's why you bring in a transfer like Sam Brown to really push that wide receiver room. So some of these guys, like a Jamie French, like a Vernell Brown, like a Cortez Mills and Dallas Wilson, those are your top 4 wide receiver targets this cycle. And unfortunately, some of those guys, you're not going to feel like they're 100% bought in or believe that Miami can really be that school until games are being played. So that's why I said from the beginning, it's just June. Let's wait till football games are being played, because this football season not only relies on recruiting this year, but it's going to rely a lot on Mario Cristobal's future and what a lot of the fan base really believe. This is his 3rd year. This is his time to shine. First game of the year against Florida, you got to win that rival game, and then you got a schedule set up to get to the ACC in Charlotte. So we're going to see what it takes. And a lot of these big time targets that we're going after, unfortunately, it's just going to be the waiting game. And that's just how recruiting goes, unfortunately.
About 60 to 70% of the views on these videos, folks, are from people that are not subscribed. So please subscribe. It's really easy. You just subscribe. It doesn't cost you a penny. In the meantime, Canes Insight with Brad and the crew over there every day with Miami football talk. And what's going to intrigue me, if this ever comes out where we know that the numbers are somewhat accurate, would be the NIL push. The NIL, not just from Miami, from everyone. Because as you were mentioning, these Georgia battles, these battles with the Bulldogs. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the upper crust of the SEC, Ohio State, Clemson, et cetera. We got to think that the majority of time, if the NIL works out in a particular school's favor by a considerable amount, that player is going to make the same kind of decision we would make. But I got to think much of the time it's a very close call. And a lot of student athletes aren't going to make a call based on $20,000. They're going to consider, okay, let's go to step 2. What's step 2? Well, I want to get developed for the NFL, or I like this school, or I like this location, or I like this coaching staff, or, these other factors come into play. When you mention Georgia, of course, they are the standard right now in college football in regards to a program. Uh, what do you think Mario's advantage is, or what he counters with throwing what Miami has to offer versus a Georgia or a Bama?
I think it just goes back to who Mario Cristobal is, right? It's the relationships, it's the honesty, it's being straightforward. Um, these guys like Mario that he's added onto this staff, guys like Coach Nicholson, the linebacker coach. I mean, that's a coach that doesn't get enough praise. He's cut from a different cloth. Any recruit that talks to Coach Nicholson, these guys just bleed different, man. They're very straightforward. A lot of these bigger schools, especially like Georgia, Ohio State, Alabama, they have enough blueprint, enough success on paper to where they don't have to continue this relationship week in, week out. They could kind of leave a guy alone for a month or two, especially if they're in their backyard, right? In the state of Georgia, in the state of Alabama. They could kind of leave that guy alone and kind of just let the logo and what they do on paper on the football field work itself. And then later on get back and say, hey, man, we haven't talked in a month or two, but as you can see, we're one of the best schools like always. Let's bring you in. Miami's not at that point yet, right? Miami has to do their due diligence. They have to be consistent week in, week out, not just on the football field, but from a recruiting aspect. And that's the strong suit of Mario Cristobal. That's the strong suit of some of the guys that he's brought in, like a Kevin Beard, like a Chevis Jackson. Chevis Jackson's doing a very good job as well. Jason Taylor, Coach Nicholson, like I mentioned. But at the end of the day, it comes down to winning football games. The NIL, the NIL is never going to go away, especially in the next 3-4 years. NIL is going to be there for the long haul. As you can see, the state of Florida, especially in high school football, has just passed the rule where NIL is now a thing in the state of Florida. So we talk about this frenzy that's happened in college football. It's going to be the same thing in high school football, especially in the state of Florida. And if you're from the state of Florida who follow high school football, you know exactly what's about to happen here. So it's going to be a frenzy and a free-for-all, right? So you have to make sure you do your due diligence as far as the recruiting aspect and communication, which Miami and Mario has always done well. But at the end of the day, it comes down to winning football games. And this is year 3 of Mario Cristobal at Miami. And this is the nitty-gritty, right? This is why you were hired. It takes a couple of years to build what you're needing to build. But as anyone that has been in the comments, as in the show, just talking about the Florida game, right? On paper, there's no questions asked. Miami has the better roster, but it's always been like that, right? When you go up against the Virginias and the Pittsburghs of the world, we've always had the better roster on paper. But what happens when the football gets snapped, right? What happens when coaching and strategies are in the mix? So this is the year 3, where Mario really has to get it done. Not just only for our football team in this season, but it's going to be heavy in recruiting as well, especially in the wide receiver room and the offensive line room. Groups, along with the secondary, like we mentioned, that are going to be key position groups to watch, that are really going to be heavily involved in how we do this football season. And it's not just us finally that believe that we're going to be something this year. It's the whole country, right? Everyone is buying in the stock of the University of Miami football program this year. And there's a reason why. And a lot of it has to do with Cam Ward.